In the damp stillness of King's Landing's dawn, the bells of the Great September of Baelor tolled in eerie unison. Their deep resonance thundered across the city, clanging off the walls of the Red Keep, reverberating through the narrow alleys and over the winding streets. Every clang felt portentous, charged with an unspoken tension. Merchants paused as they set up their stalls, as though trying to read omens in the mournful sound of metal on metal. Guards leaned at corners, halberds in hand, uncertain whether they should rush to the source or remain where they stood. The Faith Militant, bold in their star-shaped sigils, were stationed about the September and spread through the city, seemingly ubiquitous. In the Red Keep itself, Margaery Tyrell paced within her chambers. Her ladies-in-waiting hovered in silent worry, darting glances at their queen, yes, queen, but so bound by the Faith Militant's so-called penance that her regal mantle felt precarious. She had been freed from the cold cells of the Sept only days ago, no longer forced to endure the ragged scraps they called clothing. Once again she was gowned in Tyrell green, silk trimmed with gold, her hair meticulously arranged. Yet a subdued severity clung to her, a subtle hardness in her eyes. Her hunger to serve the realm, to do good, had not abated, but the illusions of safety in King's Landing had shattered. She could no longer count upon the crown's might alone. Tommen was a gentle soul, easily swayed, and the real power had shifted into the hands of the High Sparrow and his zealots. Her grandmother, Olenna Tyrell, had come to the capital with a retinue of Tyrell soldiers, under the guise of protecting Margaery and Loras. Olenna had grown outwardly more brittle, but beneath that flinty exterior lay the same cunning that had once toppled many a foe in the Game of Thrones. She had had enough of the Faith Militant's humiliations. Loras still languished under their accusations, and Margaery's imprisonment had been a personal affront. The Tyrell matriarch would not let that stand. Yet forging a clean solution had proven more complicated than simply storming the September. King Tommen, guided by the High Sparrow's cunning manipulations, had prohibited a direct assault. The young king seemed convinced that the faith was ultimately a force of righteousness. Cersei Lannister had her own vendetta against the Sparrows, but she was scarcely a reliable ally after the fiasco that had seen her publicly shamed as well. So Margaery and Olenna had to proceed carefully, or had to appear to, at least. As Margaery awaited her grandmother's arrival that morning, she recalled the stench of the cramped cell where she had been held. She had lain awake for hours on the floor of cold, damp stone, her thoughts consumed by Tommen's malleability. Each time she had prayed to the Seven in desperation, wondering how faith and reason had become so tragically divorced in this city. That time of captivity had imprinted itself upon her. She felt older, less naive than she ever had before. All her careful smiles and graceful gestures, all the courtly sweet talk that once worked wonders, had proven powerless against the fanaticism of the High Sparrow. She had realized that if she were to remain queen and keep her brother and house safe, she would have to stand on firmer ground than the illusions of a girl's charm. The Faith Militant was a weed with deep roots, tangling around the throne. Only a firm, even ruthless hand could uproot it. At last, the doors to her chambers opened, and there stood Lady Olenna, robed in muted grays and gold. Despite the weariness etched beneath her eyes, the Queen of Thorns exuded a sense of defiance that belied her advanced age. She made a dismissive gesture toward Margaery's ladies-in-waiting, who promptly scattered away, leaving the two Tyrell women alone. Margaery bowed her head to her grandmother. "Grandmother," she said softly, "I hope your rest was better than mine." Olenna gave a wry sniff. "My rest? Child, I hardly had the time to rest. There are ravens from Highgarden that demand my attention, cousins in the city who beg for an audience, and rumor upon rumor about the Faith Militant skulking about. Rest is a distant dream." She paused and looked Margaery over. "But you seem better, stronger, perhaps. Whatever wound the Faith inflicted, I see they did not break you." "They tried," Margaery murmured. "Believe me, they tried. They threatened Loras over and over, certain it would break my spirit. But I refused to yield." She lifted her chin. "If they refuse to release him from those cells, I will see the Sparrows cast out of the city. They will regret their cruelty." A glint appeared in Olenna's eyes. That is the granddaughter I know. All right then, shall we talk of how we accomplish exactly that? Margaery nodded, crossing to a small table set by the window, where a jug of watered wine waited. The delicate morning light fell through the windows, illuminating the faint tension in her posture. We must rid ourselves of the High Sparrow, but so long as Tommen is swayed by the faith militant's pious illusions, it may prove difficult to move openly. He has insisted that we rely on compassion and the Seven's guidance. He won't condone violence. Then we must find a reason, one Tommen himself can't argue against. We must force the king's hand. Better yet, we must persuade him that our actions are in the best interests of the realm. That is all that matters. Olenna slid into a chair. In truth, I've already begun laying the groundwork. Several houses sympathetic to the Tyrell cause have mustered their men just a few days' ride from King's Landing. Even some Lannister bannermen, disillusioned by Cersei's fall from power, might be swayed if it means preserving order. Margaery looked relieved. Excellent. But the city is swarming with sparrows at every corner, or men armed with cudgels wearing the seven-pointed star. What good are our armies if Tommen forbids them to act? Olenna smiled thinly. Do not underestimate the power of spectacle and necessity, darling. The High Sparrow rules by fear disguised as virtue. He exposes every man's vices, then parades them to the world to keep them in check. We must show the city what that brand of justice truly means, how it tears families apart, fosters terror. If we can ignite the people's fear against him, we will have the support to act openly. And once the small folk cry out for an end to the faith militant, Tommen will have no choice but to listen. Margaery took a small sip of the wine. How do we get there? Whose story do we tell that will stir the city's heart? The city is already stirred, child. That is the beauty of it. Rumors run rampant. Sons being dragged away, mothers flogged for trivial offenses. We need only step in, revealing that the Tyrells stand for justice and mercy, while the faith punishes with cruelty. If we time it right, we'll unseat them without inciting a full-scale riot that might harm us more. Margaery remembered the day she was marched through the streets after her release, the sea of onlookers that parted fearfully around the faith militant. The High Sparrow kept a steely calm, as if daring the crowd to disapprove. She had seen the restlessness in those faces, the suspicion. She could sense it still simmering beneath the surface of the city. Let us start by freeing Loras. He is a beloved knight of the city. Everyone remembers his feats in tournaments. If the faith militant tries to keep him, that alone might tip the balance. Olenna nodded. That is the key. Set Loras free, and do so with a triumphant air that resonates from Flea Bottom to the Red Keep. There will be no place for the faith to hide after that. I'll rally our forces discreetly, but you will need a plan to ensure Tommen sees reason. You must speak to him. Use that silver tongue for more than feigned piety. You are Queen Margaery, and if you're going to maintain that title, you had better show the realm what that word truly means. Margaery straightened and drew a steadying breath, her heart hammering not with fear but with determination. She had endured the worst the faith militant could do to her. The time for compromise was gone. If she had to use cunning, gentle persuasion, or even illusions of romance with Tommen, she would. If she had to embrace a sharper edge, she would. Because the Seven knew, the Sparrows had left her no other choice. She departed her chambers with Olenna soon after, passing by the bright banners that still hung in the corridors. Gold lions on crimson for House Lannister. Golden roses on green for House Tyrell. If only such sigils could unify in truth. But alliances here were as fragile as the glass windows that shimmered in the great hall. The warm hush of the hall was broken only by the shuffle of servants and the murmurs of passing guardsmen. Margaery's ladies-in-waiting followed at a respectful distance, offering silent support. Word reached them that King Tommen was in the council chamber with Kevan Lannister, discussing reports of unrest in the city. Margaery intended to join them. Olenna parted ways to gather the lesser lords allied with the Tyrells, to make certain they remained ready. As Margaery walked, she glimpsed the flash of gold cloak here and there, City watchmen posted at corners, busy trying to keep the peace. To think, she mused, that these men once took orders from a king who could command them to restore order in an instant. Now their loyalty was torn between the crown and the faith. Their confusion was plain. This tension was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. She arrived at the council chamber's threshold. The pair of gold-cloaked guards opened the doors for her. Inside, King Tommen was seated at the head of the table, looking pale and uncertain, while Kevan Lannister stood on the far side, arms folded across his chest. A few other council members milled about, none of them wearing the robes of the High Septon. There was no formal faith presence here, not yet. "Your Grace," Margaery said, inclining her head. Her voice echoed a little in the quiet chamber. "I trust I'm not interrupting?" Tommen looked relieved to see her. "Not at all," he said softly. "Margaery, please join us. We were discussing these rumors about the faith militant rounding up small folk at night. Some say it's punishments for drunkenness, others claim it's for petty crimes, but the details don't make sense. We're worried that the faith is exercising power beyond what we intended." Margaery dipped her head gracefully and took a seat near Tommen. She laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. "Your Grace, it's no rumor. I've heard direct accounts from the small folk. Entire families threatened at sword point or cudgel point, forced to confess to invented crimes. I know you believe in the faith, and I know you wish to see the city cleansed of corruption, but perhaps the High Sparrow goes too far." Tommen's anxious blue eyes flicked to Kevan. Kevan sighed and inclined his head. "We've had these same concerns, but the High Sparrow claims these people have indeed sinned, that all are given a chance to repent. Who are we to challenge the faith's right to hold confessions?" "You are the king's hand, Lord Kevan," Margaery replied carefully. "And Tommen is the king. The faith must answer to the throne. If we stand by while they mete out punishments without any oversight, then the people will see the crown as an accomplice to tyranny." Tommen swallowed. "I never meant for that. I was told the faith militant would help the realm, cleanse it of wrongdoing. I wanted to save Mother from the shame that overcame her, to show that I was a just king who listened to the people's spiritual needs." Margaery closed her eyes for a heartbeat, recalling Tommen's sincerity, the earnestness that made him so easy to sway. She did not want to lie to him, but if their cause required the occasional half-truth, so be it. "The people need you, Tommen. They need their king to show fairness. They need to see that you care about them more than anything. If the High Sparrow is harming innocent folk in the name of the Seven, is that truly what the gods want?" Tommen shook his head, brow creased. "But how do we stop him? He has so many men, and he says all are devoted to the Seven. The last time we threatened them with force, it nearly caused a riot. I don't want blood spilled in the streets." Her grip on his sleeve tightened, gently. "Nor do I, but perhaps a show of strength is necessary to bring him to reason. The Tyrell host is large. You remember how grandmother brought soldiers to ensure my safety, and Loras's. If they stand ready, it might be enough to make the High Sparrow surrender Loras and cease these unwarranted arrests. We need only your blessing to let them march peacefully into the city and confront the faith with the authority of the crown." Kevan rubbed his temple, clearly torn. "Your Grace, that is a bold move. The High Sparrow has threatened excommunication against any who defy him. I fear more conflict." Margaery studied Tommen's face. He looked so young, so lost. She realized, with a faint ache, that her husband might never be truly equipped for the weight of rule. "What if we extend an invitation for the High Sparrow to meet us in the throne room, in the presence of a moderate number of Tyrell forces and the King's Guard? We make it clear we only wish to talk, but we no longer want him to unilaterally conduct arrests." Tommen looked at Kevan, hope dawning in his eyes. Yes, perhaps that will work. A negotiation rather than a show of force. But if he refuses? Then we must insist, Margaery said quietly. "I fear for my brother's life, Tommen. He is your sworn knight. You owe him your protection. We must bring him home." Tommen inhaled deeply. "Yes, Loras is a good man. He should not suffer." Margaery pressed her lips together, forcing herself to appear relieved. In truth, she understood how quickly negotiations with the High Sparrow might go awry. The man was intransigent, unwavering in his convictions. She doubted words alone would free Loras. But if Tommen consented to even a limited Tyrell presence, that might prove enough. One show of force, one well-orchestrated standoff, and the faith could be broken. Kevin cleared his throat. I'll send word to the Tyrells that the king allows them to muster in the city's outer wards, but that they are not to draw weapons unless directly threatened. Margaery smiled. Thank you, Lord Kevin. With your guidance, I believe we can restore peace. Yet the promise of peace did not soothe her thrumming heart as she left the council chamber. She understood that once soldiers were in the city, events could spiral. A single spark, one overzealous Sparrow, one nervous guardsman, and blood might flow. But it was a risk she had to take, for Loras, for her family, and for a city on the brink of letting zealotry rule unopposed. That very afternoon, Tyrell bannermen began quietly arriving through the city gates. They carried themselves with calm restraint, wearing green and gold surcoats over polished mail, while their officers engaged in polite conversation with the gold cloaks. A subtle tension pervaded every street they entered, as though King's Landing itself held its breath. The small folk watched from balconies, doorways, the edges of stalls, uncertain if they should cheer or hide. News spread quickly, whisper to whisper, that House Tyrell had come to restore order and free Ser Loras from the faith's clutches. Some hissed that war was coming. Others dared to hope that the cruelty of the faith militant might soon be curbed. Meanwhile, the faith militant were not blind. Groups of them assembled by the Great September, arms folded, brows furrowed in stern disapproval. The High Sparrow called for calm among his followers, urging them not to be provoked by displays of earthly power. But behind the calm facade, all recognized the threat. If the High Sparrow bowed now, he would appear weak. If he resisted, he risked open conflict with the Tyrells and possibly the king. The next morning, summoned by a royal decree that Tommen's own scribes penned, the High Sparrow arrived at the Red Keep. He came accompanied by a group of devout men, each wearing the same dull robes, 7 pointed stars etched into their foreheads. They walked with measured steps into the throne room, past rows of gold cloaks and Tyrell guards who stood at attention. Tommen perched upon the Iron Throne, with Kevin at his right and Margaery at his left. Cersei Lannister was conspicuously absent. She watched from a high gallery, reluctant to appear publicly aligned with Margaery but equally hateful of the High Sparrow. Olenna stood among a group of minor lords off to the side, her gaze unyielding. The High Sparrow stopped at the foot of the throne steps and bowed in humble acknowledgement. "Your Grace," he began in his soft-spoken way, "I was told you have concerns about the faith's actions within this city. I am here to listen, to counsel, and to pray with you if need be." Tommen nodded, trying to project a kingly demeanor. "High Septon, we appreciate your presence. There are matters I wish to clarify. We've received troubling accounts of arrests made by your men. Arrests that seem excessive. Are they truly troubling if they are just?" asked the High Sparrow, gently but with that unwavering conviction in his gaze. "We strive to bring justice as the Seven command." Tommen's chin trembled slightly, but he squared his shoulders. "Yes, but the crown's laws still stand. Even piety must answer to justice administered by the king. I cannot have my subjects living in fear. We have a system of courts for such things." The High Sparrow cast his eyes downward in an expression of humility. "I understand your Grace's hesitation, but these are times of moral decay. The Seven demand that we cleanse the city of vice, and not all men can be brought to the light by gentle suggestions. I assure you we do not act lightly." Before Tommen could respond, Margaery spoke, her voice ringing clear across the throne room. "What of my brother, Ser Loras Tyrell, a sworn knight, one who has fought for the crown on numerous occasions? Is his alleged sin so severe that he remains locked away? When will you acknowledge that he has confessed enough, that he deserves trial under the king's justice, rather than indefinite torment in the cells?" The High Sparrow turned his gaze upon her, sadness in his eyes. "Your Grace, I would free him if I believed his soul contrite, but he clings to pride in his sins. The path of absolution is never easy. We wish to save his soul. It is not vengeance, but compassion that moves us. A flicker of anger heated Margaery's cheeks, but she forced herself to remain poised. Compassion often serves as a pleasant word for cruelty in disguise. We have not seen any progress in Loras's so-called redemption. You speak of his pride, but you do not allow him visitors who might help him find clarity. My family has not even been allowed to speak with him. Where is the compassion in that? Low murmurs rippled among the onlookers. Olenna watched with hawk-like intensity, satisfied to see the tension mount. She had carefully placed men in the crowd to amplify the effect. Whispers that the Tyrells sought only justice, that the faith was withholding it. Tommen raised a hand. "High Sparrow, I am ordering you to release Ser Loras. He will stand a fair trial under the crown's judges if necessary. But he is a knight of the realm, and you have kept him in conditions unfit for his station. This must end." For an instant, the High Sparrow's gaze flicked across the gathered Tyrell bannermen near the throne, counting their numbers, gauging the threat. Then, with that practiced air of humility, he said, "Your Grace, it pains me that you question the faith's motives. Very well, if it is your royal command, I will relinquish Ser Loras to your custody, so that he may face a trial by the laws of the realm. I can only hope the realm's judges will keep his immortal soul in mind." Tommen exhaled, relief visible. Margaery felt her heart leap at the mention of Loras's release. But she noted the High Sparrow's serene expression. He was conceding this point, yet she suspected he would not go quietly into obscurity. He would bide his time, watch for the crown to show weakness. Within the hour, Loras Tyrell was brought forth, escorted by 2 members of the faith Militant. The sight of him caught Margaery's breath in her throat. Her once proud brother, the Knight of Flowers. His beauty was known across the 7 kingdoms. But here he stood, pale, hollow-eyed, hair unevenly shorn, a bruise darkening his cheek. He moved stiffly, each step costing him visible effort. When he was released to the custody of a Tyrell guard, Margaery went to him and gently clasped his hand, words failing her in that moment. She could not fully conceal her shock at his condition. "It's all right," Loras whispered, meeting her gaze for the first time in weeks. A faint ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "I'm alive." She wanted to weep, but she pressed her lips together and nodded, quickly glancing at Olenna. The older woman had tears in her eyes, though she kept her composure. For House Tyrell, the personal cost of this fiasco was etched on Loras's face. The love they bore him fueled their resolve to unseat the faith Militant for good. Meanwhile, the High Sparrow lingered near the throne steps, observing the reunion from a polite distance. Tommen took in Loras's battered appearance with dismay, as though truly seeing for the first time the cruelty that had taken place. "Ser Loras?" The young king began haltingly. I promise you will have rest and care under the crown's protection." Loras offered a slight bow. He had been forced into such humiliations so often now that it came as an almost reflexive gesture. "Thank you, Your Grace," he said, though the weariness in his voice suggested no real gratitude toward the boy king who had allowed this to happen. Margaery guided her brother gently away, letting the Tyrell healers attend to him. The court began to disperse, many lords and ladies sending measured glances at the High Sparrow. He, however, remained, his hands clasped in prayerful pose. Margaery paused near him. She lowered her voice. "I hope you understand, High Septon, that we cannot allow our family to be used as pawns in your mission again. The realm needs peace." The High Sparrow returned her gaze without flinching. "My queen, peace and justice are twin pillars. Without justice, peace rots from within. Do not mistake this for a defeat for the faith. We will continue our righteous work, with or without the crown's favor." Margaery fought the urge to retort. She recognized the threat in his words. He would not stop. The moral inquisition would continue, hidden or overt, with the fanatics he had gathered. She gave him a polite but guarded nod and turned away, joining Olenna and Loras. Olenna's arm went around Loras's shoulders. She whispered something comforting into his ear, but her gaze darted at Margaery. They knew that the next step could not be mere negotiations. Only the removal of the High Sparrow from power would end this dangerous friction. That same evening, in a private garden alcove, the Tyrells convened in secrecy with a select group of bannermen and allies. Torchlight flickered on the hedges, revealing the anxious expressions of lords and knights. Loras, seated on a cushioned bench, was too drained to stand long, but he insisted on attending the discussion. Olenna oversaw the gathering, while Margaery stood at her side. None wore the bright finery typical of House Tyrell celebrations. This was no time for celebrating. Olenna spoke quietly but with firm authority. "We accomplished our first goal. Loras is free. Now the faith militant must be excised like the tumor it is. The question is how to do so without provoking a general revolt." A broad-shouldered bannerman, Lord Tyrell, inclined his head. "We have over 2,000 men within the city, ready at your command. The city watch might side with us if it comes to open conflict, though we cannot be sure. But any confrontation near the September or in the streets could lead to chaos." Margaery frowned in thought, remembering the tension in Tommen's face when she pressed him to accept the Tyrell presence. "Tommen wants to avoid bloodshed, so do we. But if the High Sparrow tries to bring his faith militant to arms, we may not have that luxury. Is there a way to remove him and disband the faith without turning King's Landing into a battlefield?" Another lord, tall and gaunt, spoke. "If we arrest the High Sparrow for treason or sedition, would not that justify using the city watch to enforce the crown's warrant? Then, once he's in custody, his followers may lose heart." Olenna nodded. "That has merit. We could present evidence that the faith militant is operating beyond royal sanction. We gather the small folks' testimonies, show that the High Sparrow is punishing innocents and undermining the king's authority. Then we declare him an enemy of the crown. But we must be swift. If the faith suspect our plan, they may strike first." Loras stirred, wincing at a bruise along his ribs, but determined to speak. "He has men everywhere, spies among the poor, the hungry. If we act openly, the High Sparrow will hear of it." Margaery bent toward him, speaking gently. "We'll be careful. Rest now. You've done enough." Her heart clenched at the bruises on his wrists. She could hardly bear the thought of more families suffering as theirs had. Olenna's gaze swept the group. "Tomorrow we begin collecting testimonies from those whose loved ones were taken or harmed by the faith militant. Let the witnesses speak. Let their tears speak. We shall present this evidence to the king, and do so in the presence of the city's leading figures, so that Tommen cannot be swayed in private. He'll have to appear decisive or risk looking weak. Then we accuse the faith of treason against the crown. If Tommen signs the arrest warrant, we move swiftly, using the city watch and our men. The High Sparrow can kneel to the crown or face imprisonment." Lord Tyrell rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "And if the militant resist with arms?" Olenna's stare hardened. "Then we crush them." Silence fell across the alcove, punctuated by the distant hum of the city beyond the garden walls. Everyone understood what that meant. Death, street battles, a potential riot. But the alternative was letting zealots rule the capital. They would not allow it. Margaery drew a steadying breath. "Then it is settled. In the morning we gather the testimonies. By midday we assemble the court. The High Sparrow will answer for his wrongdoing, or we will see him undone." The lords nodded assent. Loras shifted his weight painfully, but he managed a flicker of a smile at his sister's resolute stance. "I never wanted you to have to fight my battles," he said quietly. Margaery placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, brother. My battles are your battles. We fight as a family." That night, Margaery lay awake, the flicker of a candle dancing across her chamber walls. She wondered if their plan was truly foolproof. The High Sparrow was shrewd. He had outmaneuvered her once before. She could not allow him to do so again. But the city sat upon a knife's edge. How many poor souls, devout in their hearts, might flock to the High Sparrow's cause if they believed the crown corrupt? Would they blame the Tyrells for trying to protect sinful knights? She prayed quietly, though not for the Seven's intercession. Rather for her own courage to do what was necessary in the days ahead. Dawn broke crisp and clear, the sun's rays casting long shadows through the streets. Margaery's plan commenced. Olenna had men stationed in every major district of King's Landing, quietly collecting the testimonies of those who had endured the faith militant's cruelty. They wrote them down on parchment, complete with the official seals of minor justices or local notaries. Dozens of accounts piled up by midday. Families torn from their homes, men beaten for minor misdeeds, women shamed and humiliated in the streets. 2 accounts described wrongful deaths, though details remained murky. The High Sparrow, it seemed, had strayed far beyond piety, and fear had kept many from speaking out. All these accounts were compiled by early afternoon. A hush fell over the city, for word had spread that the king would hold an extraordinary session in the Red Keep. The throne room swelled with attendees, from lords and ladies to representatives of the merchant guilds. The faith militant themselves had been summoned, though they arrived in smaller numbers this time. Perhaps they sensed a trap, or perhaps they sought to project calm confidence. Margaery stood beside Tommen once again. Tommen's posture was more assured than usual. Kevan Lannister had supported him, whispering counsel in his ear. Cersei, from a side seat, watched with an unreadable expression. She was no ally of the faith, and the shame of her walk was still fresh enough that part of her might relish seeing the High Sparrow humbled. Olenna, resplendent in subtle greens, stood at the center of the hall with a roll of parchment in hand. She bowed slightly to Tommen, then spoke in a voice surprisingly potent for her age. "Your Grace, I stand before you to present the voices of the common people of King's Landing. They have endured injustice under the guise of piety. I beg your leave to read a few accounts." Tommen nodded, glancing at the High Sparrow, who stood in the front row of observers, hands clasped. Olenna began reading, her tone grave, letting the horrifying details ring out clearly through the chamber. A young boy taken from his mother on suspicion of thievery, whipped until he confessed to a crime he claimed he did not commit. A septa forced to kneel in the street by overzealous sparrows for not conforming to some strict interpretation of scripture. A blacksmith beaten for forging wine cups, apparently seen as tools of excess and vanity. On and on it went, with each account fueling the room's growing tension. By the time Olenna finished, there was a murmur of outrage in the hall. Many faces looked aghast. Even Kevan Lannister, who had tried to remain neutral, blanched. Tommen's brow grew damp with sweat. He turned to the High Sparrow. "High Septon, is this how the faith militant has been conducting itself?" The High Sparrow bowed, then stepped forward, voice calm as ever. "Your Grace, our mission is to root out sin. Some souls are stubborn, clinging to falsehoods, but we never act without cause, nor do we relish violence." "Then these witnesses must be lying?" Olenna pressed, her voice icy with indignation. "Is that your claim?" The High Sparrow let out a weary sigh. "People fear what they do not understand, Lady Olenna. I cannot speak to every detail in these accounts, but I can promise the faith always seeks repentance, not vengeance. Sometimes individuals may act overly zealous in the moment, flawed men. But to accuse the entire faith of injustice because of a few accidents is enough," Tommen said, with more strength than anyone expected. A hush fell, and the king continued. "I have heard enough to conclude that the faith militant has overstepped. The Seven do not advocate cruelty, nor does the crown permit men to administer arbitrary punishments in the streets. I have decreed that all arrests and punishments must pass through the crown's justice. Have my commands been ignored?" The High Sparrow pressed his lips tight, clearly reluctant to contradict the king outright. But his pride was evident, even behind that mask of humility. "Your Grace, if mistakes were made, let us address them together. The faith stands ready to atone for any missteps. But to paint us as criminals," Olenna's voice rang out again, cutting him off. "The city is in turmoil. Families have been ripped apart. The time for half measures is done. We call upon the king to recognize that the faith militant, as it currently stands, is an enemy to the realm's peace." A collective gasp came from the courtiers. Margaery's heart pounded. Here it was, the open accusation. She studied Tommen's face, praying he would not waver. Tommen drew himself up, clutching the gilded arms of the Iron Throne. High Septon, you stand accused of undermining the authority of the crown, causing harm to the king's subjects in the name of the Seven, and ignoring royal edicts. You must submit to the crown's investigation. Hand over the organization of the Faith Militant to the king's justice, or face charges of treason. For an instant, the High Sparrow's usually calm face flickered with something akin to anger, but he bowed his head. Your Grace, we serve the Seven. If you wish to investigate, we will cooperate. Gasps and murmurs spread anew. Margaery felt a surge of hope. Could it truly be so simple? But as she watched the High Sparrow, she caught the subtle tension in the set of his jaw. He would not go quietly. He must have an escape plan. Perhaps his men were already spread across the city, prepared for a signal. Tommen glanced at Kevin, who nodded solemnly. The king then continued, until the matter is resolved, the Faith Militant is hereby ordered to stand down. No more arrests, no more public humiliations or punishments. Their arms will be returned to the September. We will see that only ordained septons or those recognized by the crown may carry out the will of the Seven. Do you understand? I do, the High Sparrow said, raising his eyes. They were calm, but behind them simmered a fervor. We shall stand down as you command. Though if this city falls deeper into sin, if it rots from within, may the Seven have mercy on us all. Tommen hesitated at the ominous remark. Guards, he said, calling to the red and gold-clad men along the walls. Escort the High Septon back to his quarters in the Great September of Baelor. Place a watch on him to ensure compliance. Let no man pass in or out without royal permission. A cluster of guards moved forward, their halberds at the ready. The High Sparrow offered no overt resistance. He bowed again, turned, and departed with his small retinue. For the moment, the confrontation ended without bloodshed. The throne room erupted in excited chatter. Some lords rushed to congratulate Tommen on his boldness, while others whispered fearfully of what the Faith might do next. Olenna drew Margaery aside. Be on your guard, she said quietly. We must keep watch around the city tonight. The Faith may attempt something desperate. Margaery nodded, feeling a knot of tension in her chest. I'll see to it. We'll have our men stand ready. By nightfall, it seemed King's Landing was at last calm. Many small folk cheered in the streets, relieved that the Faith Militant had been ordered to lay down their arms. Bakers and brewers opened their shops late into the evening, expecting a celebratory crowd. But the Tyrell soldiers remained vigilant, posted at key intersections and near the Great September of Baelor. The Gold Cloaks joined them, newly emboldened by the king's command. But calm can be deceptive. Sometime after midnight, chaos erupted. Fires sprang up in 4 different parts of the city, suspiciously timed. Bells clanged, and the Gold Cloaks rushed to contain the flames. Amid the confusion, groups of sparrows attacked isolated pockets of Tyrell soldiers. Cries and steel rang out in the darkness. A swirl of terror enveloped the poorer districts, where the small folk cowered in their homes as robed fanatics with weapons scurried through back alleys, chanting prayers about purging the city of sinners. Margaery had not slept. She was in her solar with Olenna, Loras, and a handful of knights when a breathless messenger arrived. Your Grace, my ladies, the city is under attack in the eastern wards. The Faith Militant set fires to draw out the watch. They're ambushing them in the side streets. We must act swiftly. Loras tried to rise, ignoring his injuries. I'll go, he rasped. I'll gather my knights. No, Margaery said firmly, placing a hand on his arm to still him. She turned to the knights. Gather your men. Protect the small folk. Arrest any who bear the star of the Faith Militant and refuse to disarm. Olenna nodded. And make certain they are well led. We can't have them succumbing to fear or overreacting, turning the small folk against us. We're here to save them from the Faith's madness, not burn the city down. Yes, my lady, the knight replied, rushing out. Within moments, Margaery heard horns blowing, summoning Tyrell bannermen to their posts. She could see from a balcony a faint orange glow where fires licked the night sky. A sick feeling churned in her stomach. She wanted to be out there leading if she could, but she knew it was safer to coordinate from the Red Keep. In truth, though, her heart rebelled at the idea of cowering behind walls. Time crawled as reports trickled in. The Faith Militant had ignited storehouses in the Dock District, but the Gold Cloaks and the Tyrells managed to extinguish the flames and push them back. 2 attempts to incite a riot near Flea Bottom were put down by the presence of Tyrell cavalry patrolling the streets. Eventually, as dawn began to lighten the sky, the city quieted. The fires were reduced to smoldering embers, and the last pockets of resistance had either fled or been subdued. In the aftermath, the damage was sobering. Entire blocks scorched, at least a dozen people dead, most of them small folk caught in the chaos. A handful of Tyrell soldiers had also fallen, along with several members of the Faith Militant. A grim hush settled over King's Landing. The High Sparrow had not personally led these attacks. He was still under guard at the September, but clearly, his zealots needed no direct orders to wage their holy war. Tommen stood pale and trembling in the Great Hall the next morning, confronted by the scope of the violence. Margaery stood at his side, as did Olenna. The City Watch captain knelt before the king to deliver the final casualty list. Tommen looked ready to faint. "So many," he whispered, his voice shaking. I never wanted this." Olenna placed a comforting hand on Tommen's shoulder but did not mince words. "Your Grace, if we don't remove the High Sparrow and disband his followers entirely, this will continue. They have proven they will not submit peacefully. We must root them out." Margaery's voice was softer but firm. "These men terrorized your people, Tommen. We gave them a chance to stand down, and they responded with fire and blood. Now we must act decisively." Tommen swallowed, looking desperately at Kevin. The older Lannister nodded gravely. "She speaks the truth, Your Grace. We cannot allow these extremists to hold the city hostage." The young king exhaled. "Very well. Issue a royal decree. The Faith Militant is hereby declared a treasonous organization. Any who bear arms as part of the Faith Militant shall be arrested on sight. The High Sparrow, bring him before me." That afternoon, in one of the smaller audience chambers, the High Sparrow was presented to the king once more. He looked weary but unbroken, escorted by half a dozen gold cloaks. His expression was one of pained disappointment. Margaery and Olenna stood by Tommen's side. Cersei lingered in the background, silent but watchful. The High Sparrow cast a glance around the chamber. "So it has come to this. Am I to be tried like a common criminal?" Tommen's voice hardened. "You are responsible for inciting your followers to violence. They burned parts of my city, killed my people. I incited nothing." The High Sparrow answered quietly, his voice hoarse. "The faithful act on their own convictions. If they see sin in every alley, is it not their duty to cleanse it? The true blame lies in the city's corruption. You brand men as criminals for following the Seven, and then wonder why they rebel. You can lock me in chains, but you cannot change the hearts of those devoted to righteousness." Olenna's eyes flashed. "Righteousness does not murder children in a burning house, High Septon." A flicker of regret passed across his face, but he kept his voice steady. "I grieve for every innocent caught in the crossfire, but your solution is to stifle the faith, to silence those who speak of moral decay. This is the throne's sin pride." Tommen's hand shook at his side. He forced himself to speak clearly. "You are a dangerous zealot. I, King Tommen of the House Baratheon, do sentence you to imprisonment. You will answer for the acts committed by you and your followers." He raised his hand, and the gold cloaks moved in. The High Sparrow did not resist, but he gazed steadily at Tommen. "Then we shall see how you fare without faith to guide you." They led him away, and Margaery felt a wave of relief wash over her. At last, the head of the Faith Militant was contained. But she also felt uneasy. The High Sparrow had no fear of death or imprisonment. His faith was absolute, and while he was behind bars, Hundreds of his followers still roamed the streets or hid in secret hovels. The city would need a thorough purging of these zealots to ensure no resurgence. That night, in a council meeting with Olenna, Kevin, and a handful of key lords, Margaery listened as they discussed how to dismantle the faith's influence. "We must reassert the authority of the crown," Kevin said. "The Great September remains a place of worship, but the faith militant must be dissolved. Any who cling to it must swear fealty to the king or be exiled. Perhaps we can prevent further bloodshed with a firm ultimatum." Lord Tarly frowned. "These men are fanatics. Many will not yield. They'd rather die than break their vows." Tommen looked distressed. "We can't kill them all. That would make us no better than them." Margaery exchanged a quick glance with Olenna, then spoke gently. "Your Grace, perhaps we can follow a strategy of containment and persuasion. Offer those who lay down arms a chance at mercy to serve the Seven in a more peaceful capacity. But any who commit further violence must be dealt with. The City Watch and our troops can maintain order, searching out hidden cells of the militant." Tommen nodded, eager for a path that promised minimal bloodshed. "Yes, do that. My mother used to say we should be the shield of the innocent. Let us shield them from zealotry, not commit atrocities ourselves." In the days that followed, the Tyrell forces and the Gold Cloaks indeed swept through King's Landing. They focused on areas known to harbor the faith's devout. Some men surrendered, bowing before the crown's soldiers and relinquishing the star sigils they had once worn. Others fled. A few resisted violently, and there were skirmishes in narrow alleys, but not on the scale of the earlier assault. With the High Sparrow imprisoned and the bulk of his leadership taken captive, the faith militant's backbone snapped. Enough disenchanted small folk began pointing out their hiding places, weary of living in fear. Gradually, calm returned to the streets. The pillars of smoke no longer rose in the sky. The calls of merchants and peddlers resumed in the markets, albeit more subdued, as the city slowly recovered. The Red Keep bustled with soldiers coming and going, bearing reports of further arrests. And House Tyrell, having been front and center in restoring order, emerged in a position of great influence. Margaery was lauded by many small folk for her compassion and efforts to avoid needless violence. Olenna's name was whispered with respect and perhaps a bit of healthy fear. The Tyrell bannermen patrolled alongside the City Watch, forging a new sense of stability. Cersei Lannister, meanwhile, found herself increasingly sidelined. The small folk still remembered her Walk of Atonement and the rumors that she had once supported the faith militant for her own ends. Though she despised seeing Margaery and Olenna step into power, she had little room to maneuver. Tommen, feeling betrayed by his mother's earlier dealings with the faith, kept her at a distance. Her only ally was Qyburn, who quietly served as Master of Whisperers, but even he had limited sway in a city that now looked to the Tyrells for leadership. On the 10th day after the High Sparrow's imprisonment, Margaery presided over a small court session in the throne room. Tommen sat on the Iron Throne, but it was Margaery who guided the proceedings. She listened to the petitions of commoners who had lost property or suffered injuries during the faith militant's terror. She allocated funds to rebuild their homes, using coffers from both the Crown and House Tyrell, a calculated generosity that won her popular acclaim. She promised that the city would heal, and that the Seven's true message of compassion would not be twisted again by violence. That afternoon, after the session ended, Margaery withdrew to the Solar where Loras was resting. He had healed somewhat in the days since his release, but the emotional scars remained. She found him leaning by a window, gazing out at the city's sprawl. He turned when she entered, offering a faint smile. "My queen," he teased gently. She waved him off. "Don't you start. I've heard quite enough titles for one day." She approached and wrapped an arm around his waist in a warm embrace. "How do you fare?" He shrugged, fingers tracing the windowsill. "Better, I suppose. Tired. Even after rest and the best foods, I feel hollow. I keep seeing those cells in my mind. I won't forget them soon." He exhaled, then forced a small grin. "But I'm glad to see you wearing your crown so well. You and grandmother have done wonders. freeing the city from that tyranny. Margaery sighed softly. It came at a cost. I'm sorry we couldn't spare you from all that pain. He shook his head. You saved me, sister. That's enough. And you saved so many others from the same fate. A moment of silence passed between them, filled with a bond deeper than words. Then Loras asked, "What now? Will the Tyrells remain in King's Landing indefinitely?" Margaery pursed her lips. For the time being, yes. We can't leave Tommen on his own. Not until the city is stable. Grandmother believes we should take an even firmer grip on the capital. She wants to see the Tyrell banners raised, to show the realm who truly brought peace. But I must balance her ambition with caution. We are still nominally allies of the Lannisters. We can't appear to be usurping the throne. Loras snorted lightly. The Lannisters are a diminished house. Cersei is widely hated. Jaime is away with the army, and Kevin is no Tywin. If we're wise, we can become the real power behind Tommen's rule. Margaery glanced at the gold crown set on a nearby table, the roses etched along its rim. She had once dreamed of being the beloved queen, guiding a chivalrous king. Reality had proven far darker. Yet here she stood, a queen in more than name, shaping the fate of the capital. House Tyrell has always wanted the best for the realm, she said at length. We bring bountiful harvests, we nurture growth. Ruling King's Landing is not about vanity, but about ensuring the city recovers and thrives. Loras nodded, then gave a tired smile. You speak like a true queen. Just don't forget yourself in all this. Power can change people. Margaery looked away, remembering the cold fury that had steeled her heart when she was imprisoned. She had promised herself she would never be at anyone's mercy again. Perhaps that promise would demand more than she initially bargained for. I won't forget, she said, voice quiet but resolute. I'll do what I must, but I will hold to the ideals that make us who we are. We are Tyrells. Growing strong, that is our house words. So shall we help the realm grow stronger. 2 days later, the High Sparrow's trial began in earnest. It took place in a smaller hall, as the Great September was no longer a neutral place to hold trials. A panel of judges, with Tommen at their head, listened to testimonies from the Crown's inquest. Margaery attended, seated with Olenna. The High Sparrow stood as his own advocate, refusing to answer most questions. He claimed the proceedings were a charade orchestrated by the powerful to silence the truth. Witnesses described how his instructions had led to intimidation and cruelty, though none could say they had heard him order murder. The lines between direct command and implied consent blurred. Nonetheless, the judges concluded that his movement had incited sedition and caused grievous harm. A verdict of guilty was inevitable. When Tommen read out the decision, his voice was shaky but firm. High Septon, you have been found guilty of sedition against the crown. Your punishment shall be life imprisonment in the black cells, where you will remain until the 7 pass final judgment upon your soul. The High Sparrow bowed his head, though his voice resonated. I accept this, your grace. I have but one question. When the day of judgment comes, will you stand before the 7 with a pure heart? He raised his gaze to Margaery, lingering on her with a calm intensity. Remember that this is not the end. The gods see all. Olenna tensed at his words, but Margaery kept her composure. She would not yield to intimidation, especially now. And so the High Sparrow was escorted away, and with his departure, the last major threat of the faith militant dissolved. The sept doors were opened once more for worship, but under carefully monitored circumstances. Many of the devout, truly believing in the message of humility and charity, tried to distance themselves from the militant aspect. The city breathed easier with each passing day. In the weeks that followed, King's Landing underwent a quiet transformation. The Tyrells repaired the scorched districts, feeding the hungry and employing the unemployed to rebuild. Tommen publicly praised House Tyrell for their service, awarding them new honors in recognition of their loyalty to the crown. Yet few doubted that behind Tommen's throne stood the guiding hands of Margaery and Olenna, ensuring stability through shrewd diplomacy and an unspoken willingness to use force when required. Cersei remained an uneasy figure in the background. She watched the Tyrell's influence grow, powerless to reverse it. Some whispered that she spent her days in the Red Keep's corridors, hissing curses under her breath or plotting in the shadows with Qyburn. But her time had passed. She had unleashed the Faith Militant, and now they were undone. The city would not trust her again. Meanwhile, Margaery quietly built a new royal council that included several Tyrell-aligned lords as well as a few neutral houses, ensuring that no single faction dominated. She sought to show that her power was not purely self-serving. Publicly, she reasserted that Tommen was the rightful king, supporting his edicts and reassuring him that he was beloved. Privately, she guided him with a gentle but firm hand, making sure the city's peace held. For the common folk, the end result was a capital in which they could once again walk the streets without fear of being seized by robed zealots. Food became more plentiful thanks to Tyrell grain ships and caravans. Order reigned, and though the gold cloaks and Tyrell soldiers remained ever present, most found it preferable to the tyranny of the faith. Whispers of Margaery's kindness spread. The queen who had been unjustly imprisoned yet bore no vengeance toward the innocent, the rose who blossomed in adversity. One afternoon, Margaery stood upon a balcony of the Red Keep with Olenna, gazing out at the city. The sun lit the rooftops, the distant curve of the Blackwater shimmering. Smoke from cooking fires rose lazily, not the acrid pillars of war. "It seems we've won," Margaery said softly. Olenna snorted. "We have brought order, yes, but in King's Landing, there is never a permanent victory. There's always another turn, another threat. Still, we have accomplished more than most dared hope." Margaery nodded. She could not ignore the faint ache of caution in her heart. They had unseated the Faith Militant, but power vacuums always drew new contenders. Nevertheless, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. For her brother, for her house, for a city that had suffered enough. She turned from the balcony and began walking back inside. Olenna followed, cane tapping the tiled floor. A page scurried up, breathlessly announcing that a delegation from Dorne had arrived, seeking audience regarding renewed trade. Another piece of the realm, seeking to mend itself. Margaery took a calm breath. The responsibilities of a queen were never ending, but now she faced them with a steadier heart. The Tyrell rose had spread its roots in King's Landing soil, and for the first time in a long while, she felt not just an occupant of the Red Keep but its caretaker. As she went to greet the Dornish envoys, flanked by guards in Tyrell green and gold, Margaery reminded herself that the realm's good was the ultimate prize. She could feel the city's pulse, as if it were a living organism slowly recovering from a dire illness. With Olenna's cunning and her own compassion, she believed they could nurture that recovery, forging a golden age, at least for a time. Such was the nature of power in Westeros, fleeting and fraught with peril. But while House Tyrell held King's Landing in its steady grasp, at least the shadows of fanaticism and terror would not reign again. Outside, the bells tolled once more, not in mourning, but to celebrate a wedding in the city's western quarter, where two young lovers wed in a small sept that had survived the chaos. Life went on, forging hope from the ashes. Margaery Tyrell closed her eyes briefly, savoring the moment's peace before stepping forward as the de facto ruler of King's Landing, determined to prove that beneath her grace and courtesy lay the iron will that the throne demanded. She would keep the city growing strong, come what may. Moonlight swept across the rooftops of King's Landing, painting a pale sheen over the crooked spires and worn domes. The fires of the Faith Militant had cooled to ashes, and in their place rose cautious optimism for a new order. House Tyrell had, with guile and a certain show of force, broken the High Sparrow's hold on the capital. The great September's doors still welcomed worshippers, but no longer bore silent ranks of cudgel-wielding zealots. The man once known as the High Sparrow languished in the Red Keep's depths, awaiting a fate from which even the gods might have turned their faces. Margaery Tyrell stood at a balustrade in Maegor's Holdfast, surveying the aftermath of her family's bold intervention. Light from torches in the yard below wavered across her face, revealing a mix of determination and lingering unease. By her side was her grandmother Olenna, robed in green velvet and leaning on her cane. The two women had worked in tandem to save Loras and quell the faith militant. Now the city lay beneath their stewardship, precariously balanced between resentment, relief, and fear. "Darling," Olenna said, nudging Margaery's arm lightly, "do stop scowling. The battle's been won, or at least this particular battle. And you look so much prettier when you aren't grimacing." Margaery drew a measured breath and eased her expression. "If I do scowl, grandmother, it's only because the day's labors have been endless. We've spent hours settling property disputes from the fires, allocating funds for repairs. The people expect a queen's mercy, but coin is finite. Even with Highgarden's resources, we must manage carefully, or else we risk bankrupting ourselves." Olenna's lips curved in a faint smile. "And that is precisely why we must keep the crown's finances under Tyrell control. As long as you are queen, and Tommen remains pliable, we can direct the realm's coins more wisely than those Lannister bankers ever did. Kevin Lannister may hold the title of hand, but he is no fool. We must keep him close and cooperative, but never let him command the purse. The city's well-being depends on us." Their gazes swept across the yard, where a squadron of Tyrell men drilled by lantern light, short practice swords scraping the air. Overseeing them was Ser Fallow, a knight from the Reach known for his discipline and fairness. The presence of so many Tyrell soldiers had become ordinary in King's Landing by now. What once might have been viewed as occupation had gradually been accepted as a stabilizing force. Below the walkway, a shape passed quietly, a slender figure cloaked in black. Margaery caught the motion out of the corner of her eye and tensed until she recognized the silhouette. It was Qyburn, Cersei Lannister's gray-faced confidant. He paused a moment, looking up, though the torchlight did not fully illuminate his expression. Then he disappeared around a corner. Olenna followed Margaery's line of sight and gave a mild sniff. "Like a rat scuttling in the dark, that one. Keep an eye on him and on Cersei. They've not been idle, I'd wager, though she's been uncharacteristically quiet of late." Margaery nodded. Since the downfall of the High Sparrow, Cersei had grown strangely subdued. She offered no direct challenge to Margaery's expanding influence. Perhaps the humiliations of the faith militant had sapped her taste for confrontation. Or perhaps she brewed a deadlier plan. In King's Landing, the stillness in a rattlesnake could be more dangerous than its rattling tail. They left the balustrade and headed inside, walking the corridor that led toward Margaery's solar. The floor was strewn with fresh rushes that gave off the scent of mint, an effort by the servants to mask the city's natural staleness. Once inside the solar, the walls glowed a soft gold from several candelabras, revealing the day's disarray. Ledgers and scrolls stacked on the table, open letters from all corners of the realm. Loras waited there, carefully seated in a chair. He wore a loose-fitting doublet to accommodate the injuries he was still nursing. His arms and torso were healing from bruises and contusions inflicted by the faith militant. Though his handsome face had regained some color, the shadows under his eyes spoke of nightmares he had not escaped. He rose to greet them. "Sister, grandmother," he said in a low voice. "I was beginning to wonder if you two would be out all night brooding over ramparts." Olenna scoffed lightly. "Don't be cheeky. We were busy ensuring the city remains calm and that we're not overrun by zealots again." Margaery smiled wanly and dropped a hand on Loras's shoulder. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he replied, though as he moved, his jaw tightened. "I'm told the bruising will linger a while longer, but at least I can walk without wincing each step." "Take your time," Margaery said gently. "We have no shortage of nights if the city needs defense. You've more than earned a rest." Loras tried for a grin that fell short of genuine. "Idle rest does not suit me. If I'd had my wits about me, I never would have let those sparrows get me in the first place." "Do. Ent brood," Olenna chided. "You were outnumbered, Loras. The faith used cunning and intimidation to corner anyone they deemed sinful. That includes men as capable as you." He nodded, letting the matter drop. Margaery took a seat at the table, gesturing for Olenna and Loras to join her. She tapped a bundle of scrolls. "We have more urgent concerns. Envoys have come from Dorne, the Vale, and even from Pike, if you can believe it. They want to know who truly rules in King's Landing, and how the city's power balance might affect them. Pike, Olenna echoed, eyebrows arching. I suppose the Ironborn are always eager to sniff out an opportunity for raiding. Perhaps they believe the city is weak. Margaery rolled the top scroll open. Lord Balon Greyjoy, if he is still lord there, writes in formal courtesy that the Iron Islands wish to resume trade for certain goods from the mainland. He also hints that his daughter Yara has seized power in the Ironborn fleet, but it's not entirely clear. In any case, they want something. They always do. Loras frowned. They'll cause trouble the moment they sense an advantage. And Dorne? Prince Doran was content enough under Myrcella's betrothal arrangement, but with Myrcella having fled the city when the faith was at its height, or rumored dead in other tales, what does he want now? His letters mention a desire to stabilize the region, Margaery said, scanning the parchment. He references negotiations with the crown about trade tariffs for Dornish wines, olives, and citrus. He also wants to confirm that House Tyrell has no intention of pressing old hostilities. We know House Tyrell once marched against the Dornish in centuries past, but that's ancient history. They don't trust us because we're ascendant at the moment, Olenna put in. Dorne has always liked to keep the rest of Westeros at arm's length, but there's value in forging a stable alliance if we can. Margaery nodded. And the Vale, Loras exhaled. No doubt the young Lord Robin and his regents want to ensure they don't get tangled in a new conflict. I hear Peter Baelish still wields influence there. We should be wary of him if he's not buried by the politics of the Vale. Olenna waved a dismissive hand. Baelish is cunning, but he's a proven opportunist. If we look strong, he'll want to align with us. If we show any sign of weakness, he'll betray us in a heartbeat. A knock sounded at the solar door, and a page entered with a bow. My queen, Grand Maester Pycelle, requests your presence. He says it concerns the king's health. Margaery stiffened. Tommen? Is he all right? The page lowered his eyes. The king has had a fever since the early morning. The Grand Maester has been tending to him. Lady Cersei is with him now. Olenna's lips tightened in disapproval. Then we should attend at once, she said. The three Tyrells moved swiftly through the corridors, the page leading them to Tommen's bedchamber. They found the king propped up by pillows, his face flushed and damp with sweat. Cersei hovered nearby, her expression set in worried lines that tugged at her usual regal aloofness. Grand Maester Pycelle mumbled over a selection of potions on a small table. Margaery approached the bedside. Tommen's eyes fluttered open as he heard her steps. He tried to smile. Margaery, he said weakly, reaching for her hand. She grasped it gently, feeling the heat of his fever. Your Grace, she murmured. We're here. Can you tell us how you feel? He swallowed with difficulty. My head aches. My throat, too. I feel so warm, but cold all at once. Pycelle cleared his throat in his long-winded way. It appears to be a passing fever, my queen, likely an ailment from the city's humors. I've given him an infusion of willow bark and mint, and a tincture of honey wine to soothe his throat. He should recover in a few days if he rests. Cersei's gaze flicked to Margaery with unveiled suspicion. You'd best pray that your family's men have not brought something foul into the keep. I will not lose another child. Olenna stepped forward, ignoring the implied accusation. Fevers are common enough in a crowded city, especially with the recent fires. The air can be poor. Let's keep him comfortable. The Tyrell healers can also attend him. They're quite skilled. Cersei bristled. We do not need your healers, Lady Olenna. The Grand Maester is sufficient. Margaery kept her voice level. All the same, it might help to consult them. We want only the best for Tommen. The young king groaned softly and clutched Margaery's hand. Mother, please, let them help, he managed. I feel so. I can barely think. Reluctantly, Cersei dipped her head. Very well. But if anything happens to him, I will hold you to account. Margaery kept her reply measured and polite. I understand. We all want him to be well. While Tommen dozed, Drained by the fever, Olenna and Margaery signaled for a pair of Tyrell healers to come in. They conferred quietly with Pycelle, who huffed and preened but allowed them to check the king's pulse, temperature, and tongue. They recommended additional rest, a warm compress, and certain herbs known in the Reach for reducing fever. Cersei hovered close, hands clasped, unwilling to concede, but also unwilling to dismiss any remedy that might help her son. At last, Olenna drew Margaery aside. "We'll let them tend to him. Meanwhile, the realm does not pause merely because the king falls ill. We must continue to receive the Dornish envoys." Margaery nodded, her eyes still on Tommen. She squeezed his fingers gently, then released his hand and turned away, heart heavy. Each child of Cersei's that she had wed, Joffrey then Tommen, had met some misfortune, though Tommen's was less severe thus far. She could only hope this fever would pass without tragedy. In the Great Hall, the high columns still bore the scorch marks of torches from the Faith Militants' intrusion weeks ago, but the lingering smell of smoke had finally disappeared. Banners of red gold lions and green gold roses hung overhead, an uneasy reminder of the alliance that had placed Margaery on the throne as Tommen's queen. That alliance now skewed heavily to the Tyrell side, as the Lannisters' power was weakened by internal strife and Cersei's unpopularity. Clustered near the dais, a delegation from Dorne waited. They wore flowing silks in shades of orange and crimson, gold jewelry glinting on wrists and ears. At their head stood Ellaria Sand, accompanied by two of the Sand Snakes, Tyene and Obara. Prince Doran was nowhere to be seen, having presumably delegated these negotiations. Margaery stepped onto the dais with Olenna at her side, flanked by Tyrell guards. The herald announced them, and Ellaria dipped her head in greeting. "Queen Margaery, Lady Olenna," Ellaria said, "we come bearing Prince Doran's regards. His health prevents him from traveling so far, but he sends us to speak on his behalf. We wish to re-establish cordial relations between Dorne and King's Landing." Margaery smiled politely. "We welcome you, Lady Ellaria. I trust your journey was peaceful." Ellaria's lips quirked in a guarded smile. "As peaceful as any ride through the Stormlands and the Reach can be. We encountered no trouble that we could not handle." Behind her, Tyene Sand offered a sly grin, while Obara crossed her arms, silent and watchful. Olenna, leaning on her cane, studied them with a calculating look. "Prince Doran's courtesy is appreciated. We hope he is well, despite his health troubles." "His gout plagues him," Ellaria said, "but he is eager to see that Dorne and the Iron Throne do not drift into hostility. King Tommen's betrothal to Myrcella was complicated. We had our own hopes for the future, but the Faith Militants' chaos disrupted all. Myrcella returned to the capital for a time, but we hear contradictory stories about her fate. Has she vanished again? Is she truly hidden away in Casterly Rock?" Margaery chose her words carefully. "Myrcella Baratheon is under protection, with family loyal to the crown. The details are not for public speculation. Suffice to say, she is safe." Ellaria's eyebrows rose, unconvinced. "If you say so, Your Grace. Still, the bonds of alliance once forged by that betrothal have frayed. We come to see if another arrangement might be made to unite Dorne and the crown. We also wish to finalize trade deals for our wines and spices. The city's markets could benefit from Dornish goods, especially in these trying times." Margaery inclined her head. "We welcome such trade. Our efforts have been focused on restoring order after the Faith Militant. Now that the city has calmed, we can resume commerce. Tell me what you propose." Over the next hour, Ellaria and Olenna led a spirited exchange of offers and demands. Ellaria insisted on lowered tariffs for Dornish goods entering King's Landing. Olenna countered that the Tyrell grain shipments were crucial to Dorne, especially if they hoped to feed their populace in times of drought. Each side threatened to withhold some vital product from the other. Margaery moderated, gently guiding them toward a middle ground that might serve both interests. Meanwhile, the Sand Snakes loitered, occasionally making biting comments. Tyene asked about the city's rumored lawlessness, only to be assured that the Tyrells had tamed the worst of it. Obara demanded to know if there would be retribution for Oberyn Martell's death. Her father slain in King's Landing's arena by the Mountain, a creature of the Lannisters. Margaery and Olenna were careful to deflect, placing blame on Cersei's circle while reminding the Dornish envoys that the Tyrells had arrived in the city only after Oberyn's tragic duel. Eventually, a tentative agreement took shape. The Crown would reduce certain import taxes for Dornish produce, while Dorne would facilitate safe passage of Tyrell supply caravans through the Prince's Pass and the Bone Way. The conversation hinted at a broader alliance if it proved mutually beneficial. As the negotiations drew to a close, Ellaria offered a polite bow to Margaery. "You have proven a wiser presence on the throne than most we have seen, Your Grace," she said. "I only hope your hold on King's Landing remains firm. The realm is vast, and many threats move in shadow." Margaery returned a measured smile. "We thank you for your concern, Lady Ellaria. House Tyrell believes in growth, in nurturing alliances rather than forcing them. Let us sow seeds of prosperity between us." With the meeting concluded, Olenna instructed servants to guide the Dornish delegates to comfortable quarters in the Red Keep. As Ellaria and her retinue departed, Olenna turned to Margaery, arching a brow. "Perhaps that wasn't as prickly as I feared. Ellaria can be volatile, but she's no fool. This may mark a step toward real cooperation." Margaery nodded, though she noted the cold glint in Ellaria's eyes whenever Oberyn's name was mentioned. There was an old wound there, one that might never fully heal. But for now, practicality dictated caution rather than open hostility. Over the following days, the fever that plagued Tommen rose and fell in waves. Margaery made frequent visits to his bedside, sometimes finding Cersei there, other times finding Pycelle puttering with potions. The Tyrell healers also made their recommendations, which Pycelle grudgingly implemented. Tommen rallied whenever he drank their herbal concoctions, only to relapse after a few hours. Cersei seemed to fray under the tension. Her hair still kept short from the humiliations of her walk. She wore heavier cosmetics to mask the lines of stress. At times, she would lash out at servants or Pycelle if Tommen moaned in discomfort. At other times, she sat by him, whispering motherly reassurances that the fever would pass. One afternoon, Margaery found Tommen awake and lucid, though he was pale and sweating. He managed a faint grin as she entered. "Margaery," he said in a wavering voice, "I keep dreaming of a golden lion and a golden rose dancing in the sky above me. They shimmer and swirl, sometimes fighting, sometimes embracing." She sat carefully on the edge of the bed and stroked his hair back from his clammy brow. "It's just a fever dream. Rest." He swallowed and looked at her with pleading eyes. "You won't let the city fall into chaos again, will you? I want to be a good king. I want everyone safe and happy." She smiled, though her heart pinched at his vulnerability. "I promise, my dear. I'll do everything I can to keep the peace. You focus on getting better." He closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. She stayed with him a while, letting him drift off. It was not lost on her that if Tommen's fever worsened, if the gods willed another tragedy for Cersei's children, she, Margaery Tyrell, would be a widow again, possibly left in a precarious position unless she claimed the regency or found a way to maintain control. The notion weighed heavily. She did not wish for Tommen's death. He was gentle, and she had genuine sympathy for him. But in the Game of Thrones, tragedy for one often meant opportunity for another. When at last she left Tommen's chambers, she found Loras waiting in the corridor, leaning against the wall for support. He pushed off it at her approach. "How is he?" "Uncertain," she said softly. "I pray the fever breaks soon." Loras nodded, brow knitting. "Perhaps a bit of fresh goat's milk might soothe his stomach. That helped me once when I was ill after a wound. The kitchens can prepare it warm." She squeezed his arm. "Good idea. Will you see to it?" Loras agreed, limping away to handle the matter. As he left, Margaery caught sight of Qyburn lurking at the end of the corridor. His gaze flickered toward her, then he retreated around a corner. Her stomach tensed. She had tried to keep close tabs on him, aware of the rumors swirling about his experiments in the Red Keep's dungeons. Unspeakable acts that even the faith militant had once condemned. But with so many other urgent matters, Qyburn had slipped into near invisibility. She followed, determined to speak to him. Turning a corner, she descended a narrow stairway that led toward the lower levels of the keep. The torches here burned fitfully, leaving pockets of gloom along the walls. She heard footsteps echo, but Qyburn's silhouette kept slipping away. Finally, near a dim archway, she found him halted by a locked iron door, fiddling with a ring of keys. He froze when he realized she stood behind him. Slowly, he turned, wearing that polite, half-smiling expression. "Your Grace," he murmured. "Is something the matter?" Margaery's posture remained poised, but her tone was cool. "I might ask you the same, Master Qyburn. What business do you have in these corridors?" He raised a brow, showing no overt alarm. "I attend to my own laboratory. I have the king's permission to research certain medical curiosities that may further the realm's understanding of healing." "I assumed you knew." She stepped closer, her voice low. "The king is ill. Our Grand Maester is baffled by the fluctuation of his fever, and the Tyrell healers are doing all they can. If you know something about his ailment, or if you have a cure you have not shared, I expect you to tell me at once. The city cannot bear another tragedy." Qyburn pressed his hands together in an approximation of contrite respect. "Your Grace, if there were a single miracle brew to banish fever, I'd provide it immediately. But my specialty lies in more specialized forms of study. Reanimation of tissue, advanced surgical techniques. Fevers are hardly my domain." Margaery studied him, searching for a hint of deceit. She remembered the monstrous figure rumored to be Ser Gregor Clegane, now a silent, hulking mass in Kingsguard armor. A creation, some whispered, of Qyburn's macabre craft. "Then do not meddle in our efforts to heal the king," she said sharply. "Stay away from Tommen's chambers unless explicitly invited." He inclined his head. "Of course, my queen. I live only to serve." She did not move, and he made a slight show of unlocking the iron door. Beyond it, a dark corridor stretched, unlit torches on the walls. The smell of old stone and something fouler emanated from within. Qyburn stepped through and closed the door behind him with a scrape of metal, leaving Margaery with a chill rippling across her skin. Returning to the upper floors, she resolved to speak to Olenna about Qyburn's presence. If his knowledge of the black arts could endanger Tommen, or if Cersei intended to exploit him for some scheme, Margaery wanted him under watch. She sensed that he was the kind of creature who thrived in darkness, quietly carrying out tasks best left unknown to the sunlight. Later that day, Margaery found Olenna in her chambers, sorting through an array of letters, her cane resting on the arm of a carved chair. Lady Olenna did not look up as Margaery entered, continuing to scribble notes in neat lines. "Darling," Olenna murmured, "if you bring me any more requests for funds to fix burned taverns, I might scream. We've already approved a dozen such claims." Margaery closed the door and stepped closer, voice hushed. "Grandmother, we may have a more pressing issue. Qyburn lurks below in the dungeons, dabbling in his dark arts. I confronted him, and he gave no useful answers." Olenna made a faint sound of disgust. "I've never trusted that man. He was expelled from the Citadel for a reason. Rumor has it he conducts experiments that would appall even the most unscrupulous maesters." Margaery nodded. "We need to decide how to handle him. If he's an ally of Cersei, he could help her orchestrate some revenge. If we remove him abruptly, though, we risk provoking her directly. You know how she clings to any weapon she might have." Olenna's lips pursed. "Let's keep him in check. Assign men to watch him discreetly. Any sign of suspicious activity, missing servants, hushed nighttime deliveries, and we act. We can't have him meddling with the king's health or conjuring some monstrosity to set loose upon us." Margaery agreed. Before she could speak further, a knock came at the door, and a guard announced the arrival of Lord Kevan Lannister. Olenna exchanged a quick glance with Margaery, then called for the guard to let him in. Kevan Lannister entered, dressed in formal attire, his lined face stern. He bowed respectfully. "Your Grace, Lady Olenna, forgive the intrusion. I bring news from Casterly Rock." Margaery gestured for him to speak. Olenna watched him, her posture rigid. Though Kevin was more moderate than many of his kin, the Tyrells did not trust him blindly. Kevin cleared his throat. "My son Lancel is dead." He took a breath, as if letting the words settle. He had joined the Faith Militant, as you know, and was part of their ranks when they caused chaos in the city. It seems that, in the skirmishes that followed the High Sparrow's arrest, Lancel was fatally wounded. I received confirmation only recently from a Septon who tended him. A flicker of discomfort crossed Olenna's features, but she quickly masked it with regal composure. "I am sorry for your loss, Lord Kevin. War, even a brief one in the streets, claims many lives." Margaery inclined her head gently. "Your nephew was a devout man by all accounts. I regret that the violence reached him." Kevin nodded, though grief pinched the corners of his eyes. "There's no undoing it. I come also with another matter. Jaime Lannister has returned to King's Landing." Olenna raised her brows. "Returned from Riverrun so soon?" "Yes," Kevin said. "He managed to negotiate an end to the siege there, according to letters I received. With Riverrun under Frey control again, Jaime has returned, likely at the Queen Mother's behest. I expect he'll seek an audience with Tommen as soon as possible, and with you, my queen." He paused. "Jaime remains the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, after all. He'll want to assess the situation with the Faith Militant." Margaery felt a subtle shift in her stomach. Jaime Lannister was a formidable figure, once the greatest swordsman in the realm, though he'd lost his sword hand. He was also fiercely loyal to Cersei. Still, he was less volatile than his sister, sometimes even reasonable. "Thank you for informing us, Lord Kevin. I'll receive Jaime respectfully, of course." Kevin exhaled. "I appreciate that. With all the tensions in the city, I hope Jaime's return will not spark new conflict." Margaery forced a reassuring smile. "We share that hope." When Kevin took his leave, Olenna drummed her fingers on the arm of her chair. "Jaime Lannister, back in King's Landing," she mused. "He could rally whatever remains of Lannister influence behind Cersei. We must tread carefully." Margaery nodded, imagining the swirl of loyalties Jaime might stir. The City Watch had grown accustomed to Tyrell leadership, but if Jaime demanded they act in the name of the Kingsguard, some might be torn. "Let's keep the city stable. There's no reason for Jaime to challenge us unless Cersei pushes him to do so. We'll present ourselves as the king's loyal supporters, open to cooperation. If conflict arises, well, we'll be prepared." Within a day, word arrived that Jaime Lannister was at the city gates with a modest retinue of Lannister bannermen. Margaery coordinated a welcome that was neither overly grand nor insulting. She sent a delegation of gold cloaks to escort him to the Red Keep, flanked by a small honor guard of Tyrell knights, an unsubtle reminder that King's Landing was under Tyrell protection. Jaime arrived in the Red Keep's courtyard at dusk. Torchlight reflected off the gilded lion crests on his breastplate. He dismounted, tossing his reins to a stable boy. The left sleeve of his tunic hung loose where his hand had once been, and in place of a flesh hand was a crafted golden replica. He surveyed the yard with a practiced air, noticing Tyrell men stationed on the walls, the roses of Highgarden displayed as prominently as the Lion of Lannister. His mouth tightened slightly, but he betrayed no open displeasure. Margaery, attending with Olenna and several courtiers, came forward to greet him. She wore a gown of emerald green trimmed with gold thread, a subtle reflection of both Tyrell and royal colors. "Ser Jaime," she said warmly, inclining her head. "Welcome home." Jaime dipped his head in a courteous gesture. "Your Grace, Lady Olenna, I see the city has changed." Olenna sniffed. "Indeed, thanks to that dreadful Faith Militant. But you'll find it more peaceful now that we've done the dirty work of subduing them." "Did your journey from Riverrun prove fruitful?" He shrugged, face impassive. "A resolution was reached, though not one that pleases everyone. The Blackfish refused to yield but disappeared in the chaos. Still, the Freys control the castle. I had no reason to remain. Margaery stepped in. We've heard the rumors. We're grateful you've returned safely. The king, your nephew, has been ill, but we trust he'll be well enough to see you soon. A flicker in Jaime's green eyes betrayed worry. Tommen is ill? Just a fever, Sir Jaime? Margaery said, choosing a reassuring tone. We have healers tending him day and night. He is young and strong. The fever will pass. Jaime nodded curtly, glancing around at the Tyrell guards. Then he gestured with his golden hand. I'd like to see him at once, if you don't mind. Margaery guided him inward, Olenna walking behind them. As they ascended the winding stairs to Tommen's chamber, Jaime asked in a low voice, How did all this happen? I've heard scattered accounts. The High Sparrow took control of the city, imprisoned you, and then some confrontation in the streets. Margaery recounted the highlights briefly. The Faith Militant's rise, Loras's imprisonment, the forced submission of Cersei and herself, the final standoff where Tyrell forces subdued the fanatics. She did not dwell on the humiliations both she and Cersei had suffered. Jaime listened, his face growing taut. I only wish I'd been here to stop it, he said quietly. They found Tommen drowsing under heavy covers, with Pycelle nodding off in a chair nearby. Cersei, perched at Tommen's bedside, straightened at the sight of Jaime. A mixture of relief and frustration flickered in her gaze. Jaime, she said, you've finally returned. He dipped his head. Cersei, she stood, kissing him once on each cheek in a stiff show of familial affection. Tommen's fever lingers, but the Grand Maester swears it will pass. I've prayed to the Seven to spare him. Margaery watched this exchange from a pace back, carefully maintaining a neutral expression. Jaime turned to Tommen, gently brushing the boy's hair aside. Tommen stirred, blinking blearily. Uncle? He rasped. Yes, Tommen. I'm here, Jaime said, voice softened. I'll stay as long as you need. A faint smile touched Tommen's lips before he slipped back into feverish slumber. Jaime regarded him for a moment, then turned to Margaery. We'll speak more of this city's state when he recovers. For now, I'd like to remain here. Margaery inclined her head. Of course. If you need anything, you have only to ask. In the corridor outside, Olenna gave Margaery a telling look. Jaime is protective. If Tommen's condition worsens, expect him to blame us, or at least to bristle at our decisions. We should keep him informed, or he might suspect we're maneuvering behind his back. I agree, Margaery said. Let's ensure he sees that House Tyrell has the city's best interests at heart. A few days passed, during which Margaery strived to strike a balance between showing Jaime courtesy and reminding him that the Tyrells were indispensable. She arranged for daily briefings with him about the city's reconstruction, the disbanding of the Faith Militant, and the ongoing negotiations with Dorne. Jaime seemed reserved, no doubt uneasy at seeing the Tyrell rose overshadow the Lannister lion in the capital, but he made no open moves against them. Throughout all of this, Tommen's fever continued to ebb and flow. Sometimes he seemed on the brink of improvement, only to relapse by nightfall, coughing and shivering. The healers insisted the fever simply needed time. Cersei hovered like a guard dog, rarely leaving her son's side. On the rare occasions she did, she sought out Jaime in private conversation. Margaery could only guess at what they discussed. Late one evening, Margaery found herself in the royal library, poring over old records of King Baelor the Blessed's reign. He too had contended with a fanatical faith militant in his day. She was searching for any precedent that might guide her on how to fully uproot zealotry from the capital. A single torch burned behind her, casting shadows over centuries-old tomes. As she turned a brittle page, footsteps sounded in the hall. A voice spoke from behind her, low and venomous. Still playing the virtuous queen, I see, researching how best to appear pious and good to the masses. Margaery did not jump. She recognized Cersei's voice. Closing the tome gently, she turned to face the older woman. I read to find solutions for the city's troubles, Margaery said evenly. It needs stability. Cersei stepped forward into the torchlight, her face drawn. The city was stable until your brood of flowers decided to take root here, meddling in the crown's affairs. Margaery resisted the urge to bristle. The city was in chaos. The faith militant, whom you yourself empowered, imprisoned me, imprisoned my brother, humiliated you. It was House Tyrell that removed them. Cersei's cheeks flushed. That's the only reason you cling to Tommen, isn't it? To strengthen your own position. Margaery held her gaze without flinching. I care for Tommen. He's a gentle boy in a cruel world. If you cannot see that our presence is what keeps him safe, then you are blinding yourself. Cersei's eyes narrowed, but her voice wavered slightly. If anything happens to him, if he dies of this fever, I will destroy every last one of you. Margaery's heart panged, not with fear, but with a certain pity. I don't want him to die, Cersei. I'm doing all I can to ensure he recovers. The best healers in the realm attend him. Why would I wish my own husband's death? Cersei looked away, as if wrestling with an inner demon. Then, with a tight jerk of her head, she turned and left, footsteps echoing in the corridor. Margaery let out a slow breath. She recognized that Cersei's threat came from desperation, a mother's terror more than a carefully plotted plan. Still, the woman was capable of monstrous acts if cornered. Margaery reminded herself never to underestimate her. News continued to swirl in the city. Rumors that the Targaryen girl across the narrow sea, Daenerys, had gathered a vast army and soared upon dragons. Whispers that the Night's Watch in the far north had faced horrors beyond the wall. But King's Landing had become insular in its concerns, consumed by the aftermath of the faith militant's downfall and the question of Tommen's health. All the while, House Tyrell strengthened its hold. Merchants praised the influx of grain and fresh produce. Craftsmen found work in reconstructing burned neighborhoods, all funded by Tyrell gold. Soldiers from the Reach patrolled in coordination with the Gold Cloaks, building trust. It seemed that each passing day further cemented Margaery's image as a benevolent queen, wise and compassionate. The small folk in Flea Bottom began calling her the Rose of Mercy, a moniker that spread quickly. Such popularity did not go unnoticed by the remnants of House Lannister. Kevin remained civil but watchful. Jaime walked the corridors with measured calm, always ready to defend Tommen's rightful claim, but uncertain how to challenge the Tyrell ascendancy without harming the city. Only Cersei let her anger surface now and then, in cutting remarks or simmering glares. At last, a turning point came one early morning when Tommen's fever broke. Margaery was summoned by a panting page to the king's chambers. She arrived to find Tommen sitting up, sweat-soaked but clear-eyed, sipping water with the help of Pycelle's shaky hands. Cersei stood behind him, tears on her cheeks. Jaime hovered nearby, a look of immense relief on his face. "Margaery," Tommen said, voice still hoarse. "The fever's gone. The maester says I'll be well." She sank to her knees beside the bed, pressing her hand to his forehead to feel the blessed coolness. Thank the Seven. She felt genuine relief surge through her. Relief that the boy she had come to care for would live, and relief that no cataclysmic power shift would be forced upon her. Cersei gently stroked Tommen's hair, her tears quickly brushed away. Her eyes flicked to Margaery, but for once, there was no scorn, only the gratitude of a mother who had not lost her child. Pycelle tottered, bowing to them. "His Grace needs rest, but I believe the worst has passed." Jaime clapped a hand on Tommen's shoulder. "We'll let you sleep, but be assured I'm not leaving your side until you're fully recovered." As the news spread that the king's fever had broken, a wave of collective exhalation seemed to pass through the capital. The Tyrell bannermen were relieved that they need not pivot to a regency struggle. The small folk, many of whom had grown to admire Tommen's gentler reign, rejoiced that they would not endure the chaos of another royal death. With Tommen on the mend, Margaery busied herself organizing a festival of thanks to the gods for the city's deliverance from the faith's terror and for the king's recovery. It would be a modest affair at first, music, food, and prayers offered in newly refurbished septs, but its purpose was more than mere celebration. It was a chance for the people to come together, to see that their king still lived and that House Tyrell would continue supporting them. In the corridors, Olenna pulled Margaery aside. "We've received a raven from Highgarden. My son, Mace, is boasting of new victories over bandits near the Manor. He wants to ride to King's Landing for a grand parade." Margaery suppressed a sigh. "Father does love his parades, but perhaps that's exactly the spectacle we need. If we allow him to march in with the banners, it'll reinforce the message that House Tyrell stands strong behind the crown." Olenna narrowed her eyes. "Just be sure he doesn't make a fool of himself. We can't have him trampling over the city with half-witted theatrics. But a display of unity might do us some good." They stood in the courtyard as they spoke, the autumn sun warming the worn stones underfoot. Overhead, ravens circled, cawing. Guards in Tyrell livery practiced spear drills. Some Lannister men-at-arms, newly returned with Jaime, eyed them from the far side of the yard, uncertain of their place. Within days, Mace Tyrell arrived in suitably grand fashion. A column of horsemen with fluttering green banners, trumpeters announcing their approach, wagons laden with gifts. The city gates opened to receive them, and the small folk, encouraged by the promise of free bread and amusements, lined the streets to watch. Mace, in golden armor and an ostentatious feathered helm, waved like a conquering hero, beaming as though he had single-handedly ended the Faith Militant's tyranny. Beside him rode Ser Bronn of the Blackwater, sporting a half-grin that suggested he'd rather be in a tavern but was happy enough to bask in any spoils that might come his way. Margaery and Tommen, still convalescent but well enough to dress and appear in public, received Mace at the Red Keep's gates. Olenna hovered near, muttering that her son's vanity was enough to fill 3 lesser men. Jaime and Cersei stood by, forced to watch as the Tyrell procession swept into the courtyard in a show of force and unity. "Well met, father," Margaery said, smiling as Mace dismounted. He clapped Tommen on the shoulder, exclaiming in a booming voice, "Your Grace, you look fit as a fiddle. I hear you fought off a fearsome fever and emerged victorious." Tommen offered a polite smile, though he still appeared a touch wan. "We're grateful to House Tyrell for all they've done." Mace puffed out his chest. "Yes, well, we Tyrells always know how to keep our friends close, eh? Now I bring good tidings, food, gold, and men to strengthen our cause. The city shall flourish again. Mark my words." From across the courtyard, Margaery noticed Jaime watching with an unreadable expression. Cersei's lips were pressed into a near-thin line, her gaze hostile. She seemed to interpret every Tyrell banner as a personal affront. Margaery, not wanting tensions to flare, quietly guided Mace and his retinue inside for a feast prepared in their honor. The feast that night was lively, though Tommen retired early, still recovering. In the great hall, tables groaned with roast meats and pastries shaped like roses, courtesy of the Tyrell cooks. Musicians played jaunty tunes, filling the vast chamber with a festive air that the city had not enjoyed in many moons. Courtiers from lesser houses arrived, eager to be seen mingling with the Tyrells, who now held King's Landing in their confident grip. Olenna presided from a seat near the dais, occasionally trading barbs with Mace or offering sharp wit to keep the lesser lords on their toes. Margaery circulated among the guests, bestowing charming smiles, ensuring that those who had lost property during the Faith's rampage were introduced to allies who might help them rebuild. She made a point of speaking kindly to a few Lannister bannermen as well, reminding them that the Tyrells did not seek to supplant the king, but to support him. Jaime remained present, sipping wine, his golden hand resting on the table, the torchlight gleaming off it. He watched Margaery with frank curiosity. Once, their gazes met, and he inclined his head politely before turning away. Cersei, however, did not linger. She took a cup of wine and disappeared from the festivities early, leaving behind an air of tension that the music could not entirely banish. As the night wore on, Margaery slipped away from the crowd to find a moment of quiet in the adjacent hallway. She leaned against a column, exhaling. Victory, no matter how well orchestrated, brought its own form of exhaustion. Soft footsteps approached, and she turned to see Ilaria Sand emerging from a side archway. The Dornish woman wore a deep crimson gown that contrasted with her duskier skin, and her lips curved in a subtle smile. "Queen Margaery," Ellaria said, nodding. "The feast is splendid, though I find I've had my fill of your Reachman pastries. One can only handle so much sugar in a night." Margaery laughed softly. "They do like to ensure no one goes hungry." Ellaria's eyes flicked over her. "You seem tired, Your Grace. These are turbulent times, even in celebration." Margaery did not hide her weariness. "It's been a demanding year, restoring the city, quelling the faith's remnants, keeping alliances afloat." Ellaria took a step closer, lowering her voice. "There's something you should know. My sources in Dorne tell me of certain developments that might affect us all. Word has reached Prince Doran that ships bearing a dragon banner were sighted near Slaver's Bay. Whether or not the stories are true, it suggests Daenerys Targaryen may be preparing an invasion." Margaery felt a stirring of both apprehension and fascination. The rumors of the Dragon Queen had swirled for years, but never had they felt so real. If she truly has dragons, Westeros could face a new threat or a new salvation, depending on how you look at it. Ellaria shrugged gracefully. "I have no special love for Targaryens, but if she arrives with enough force, the squabbles in King's Landing could become irrelevant. You would do well to prepare for the possibility. That's my counsel, freely given." "Thank you," Margaery said sincerely. "We'll heed that warning." Ellaria studied her a moment longer, as if measuring her sincerity. Then, with a small nod, she drifted back toward the feast, leaving Margaery alone in the corridor once more. After a moment, Olenna emerged from the hall, hooking her arm through Margaery's. She wore a look of faint amusement. "These Dornish can be so melodramatic, can't they? Whispering rumors of dragons while we're still digesting our dinner. You should rest, child. Tomorrow, the city expects you to watch over the opening of that new sept we had rebuilt. A queen's work is never done." Margaery managed a soft smile and let Olenna guide her away. She tried to push aside thoughts of Targaryens and dragons for at least one night, focusing instead on the surety of what she had. King's Landing at peace, House Tyrell in ascendancy, and a fragile but stabilizing alliance with Tommen on the throne. Yet as she drifted towards sleep later that night, curled among plush pillows in her chamber, her mind conjured images. A once shackled silver-haired queen commanding armies across the sea, monstrous creatures winging overhead, fire sweeping the horizon. Margaery wondered if all her careful gains in King's Landing might be scattered to the wind by a single dragon's roar. Morning arrived, bright and clear. King's Landing stirred to life under the watchful eyes of Tyrell men posted at the gates. Merchants hawked fresh produce from Highgarden's fields. The scent of bread and olives wafted in the mild breeze. Margaery, dressed in a flowing gown of pale green for the day's ceremonies, preparing to accompany Tommen to bless the reopened sept in the Dragon Pit district. As she stepped into the corridor, she nearly collided with a breathless gold cloak rushing toward her. "Your Grace," he panted, bowing. "There's a crowd gathering outside the Red Keep, dozens of small folk, chanting your name." Margaery raised her brows. "My name? Yes, my queen. They say they want to thank you for the bread and the repairs. They're calling out for the Rose of Mercy." Olenna, who stepped out of a nearby room in time to hear this, made a wry face. "Well, you wanted the people's love, child. It seems you have it." Margaery felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, though she maintained a calm demeanor. "I'll go to them. Lead the way." She was escorted through the Red Keep's gates to the outer ward, where a throng of commoners stood, carrying small garlands of flowers and homemade banners. The moment Margaery appeared, a wave of cheers swept the crowd. Several women knelt, offering flowers. A group of children scampered forward, each presenting a wildflower as though it were a precious gift. Margaery accepted the blooms with a smile, speaking kindly to the children. One little girl with wide brown eyes tugged at her skirt. "Thank you, Your Grace," the child said. "My ma says we have bread now because of you. We were hungry before." Touched, Margaery knelt to the girl's level. "I'm happy you have food. Remember, we must all help each other." The crowd applauded. Under the watchful gaze of Tyrell guards, Margaery spent time talking to them, listening to small requests, repairs for a leaky roof, a missing brother who might have run off with the faith militant, a desire for new well water in a certain district. She promised she would see what she could do. Watching from a balcony, Cersei stood with folded arms, her face carved in stony resentment. Jaime appeared behind her, taking in the scene with a more measured expression. He murmured something to Cersei, who shook her head. They disappeared back inside. In that moment, Margaery felt a swell of confidence. The people's adoration was not some trivial vanity. It was a shield, a currency in the Game of Thrones that could protect her from Lannister maneuvers. She understood that hearts could be fickle, but if she continued to feed, clothe, and respect these people, they might well remain loyal. When the crowd finally dispersed, Margaery returned to Tommen's side, helping him don his royal attire for the Sept blessing. He complained that his legs still felt weak, but his eyes shone with excitement at leaving his sickbed. "I've missed being among the people," he said. "I want them to see I'm not some invalid." Margaery offered an encouraging smile. "They'll be glad to see their king again, and you've regained your color. Just lean on me if you need." A royal litter carried Tommen partway, with Margaery riding alongside on a white mare. The route to the refurbished Sept led through major streets, lined with curious onlookers. The mood was festive, a far cry from the days of the Faith's harsh patrols. The Tyrell banners fluttered, though occasionally Margaery saw the Lannister lion displayed as well, presumably at Jaime's insistence. At the Sept, a crowd of worshippers had gathered to witness the king's blessing. The newly constructed doors, engraved with roses and lions entwined, opened onto a space that still smelled of fresh carpentry. The altars within stood free of any militant decoration, overseen by Septons who had publicly renounced the High Sparrow's movement. Tommen, leaning on a cane for support, walked slowly toward the dais inside the September. Margaery walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, guiding him as needed. Olenna was present in the background, as were several lords of the court. Cersei and Jaime stood off to one side, watchful but silent. In a brief ceremony, Tommen thanked the Seven for his recovery and for peace in the city. The Septon led a prayer for unity among all houses, that the tragedy of the Faith Militant not be repeated. The worshippers bowed their heads in reverence. Margaery saw tears in some eyes, no doubt recalling the terror of robed fanatics roaming the streets. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, that House Tyrell had delivered them from that fear. After the ceremony, Tommen turned to Margaery, gently clasping her hand. "None of this would have been possible without you," he said, his voice echoing softly in the vaulted space. "And without your house, if only my mother and you could truly see eye to eye." Margaery gave his hand a light squeeze. "I've tried, Tommen. We simply have different ways of protecting those we love. I'm sure in time she'll see reason." He nodded, though he looked uncertain, as if not fully believing that day would ever come. The next morning, however, any hope of calm acceptance by Cersei was challenged. An alarm sounded within the Red Keep, and Margaery was roused at dawn by frantic knocking at her chamber door. She threw on a robe and found a guard standing there, panting. "Your Grace, come quickly. There's been an attack in the dungeons." Heart-hammering, Margaery hurried after him. He led her down flights of torchlit stairs to a corridor outside the cells where the High Sparrow had been kept. The smell of blood was fresh in the air. Tyrell soldiers and gold cloaks clustered around. Olenna arrived at the same time from another stairwell, face grim. They pushed through the throng and discovered the iron-bound door ajar. 2 guards lay on the threshold, throats cut. Inside the cell, the High Sparrow's bunk was empty. A puddle of dark blood stained the stone floor, but there was no body. One of the men investigating turned to Margaery, horror in his eyes. "He's gone, my queen. Either escaped or abducted." Olenna finished, voice terse. Margaery's gaze swept the cell. Whoever had done this had left no sign of where they took him. The only clue was a smear of blood across the wall, shaped like a crude 7-pointed star. A chill prickled at her spine. Was the High Sparrow rescued by extremist followers? Or had someone else orchestrated this? Cersei and Jaime arrived moments later. Cersei's face was pale, but Margaery detected no triumphant smirk, no suggestion she had arranged it. Jaime surveyed the dead guards, his jaw tightening. This is madness. How did anyone get past our watch to free him? Anger flared in Margaery's chest. She turned to the guard commander, voice cold as steel. Double the patrols. Search every corner of the keep and the city. If he's at large, we must recapture him immediately. We cannot let the faith militant rekindle. Olenna addressed Jaime. We'll need your support as well. The gold cloaks must coordinate with our men. He nodded. You have it. Cersei stood very still, eyes fixed on the blood on the floor. Then she said, so quietly that only Margaery and Olenna could hear, if that fanatic rises again, I will burn this city to stop him. Margaery felt the old sense of dread coil in her belly. She looked from Cersei's pale face to the ominous star of blood on the wall. The High Sparrow might be wounded or dead, or plotting another wave of terror. One crisis had been stifled, but new shadows lurked, ready to pounce. So it was in King's Landing, where every victory birthed a fresh threat. Margaery understood with renewed clarity that the game never truly ended. She had seized the capital from the faith militant, restored order, won the affection of the people, and nurtured a fragile alliance with Tommen. Yet no matter how carefully she and Olenna planned, the realm's serpents slithered in the darkness, from Qyburn's hidden lair to the freshly escaped High Sparrow. Amid the swirl of suspicion, loyalty, and intrigue, House Tyrell's hold on King's Landing would be tested again, and soon. But for now, Margaery lifted her chin, burning resolve in her eyes. She would not allow the fanatic's venom to poison the city again. The rose of mercy, perhaps, but behind the petals, she was steel. She signaled the guards to begin their search. If she had to uproot every shadow, every hidden cell, every possible betrayal, then so be it. She had faced the darkness once before and prevailed. She would do so again. Outside, the dawn sky glowed in pale gold, promising a new day. Inside the Red Keep, soldiers hurried to their posts, and murmurs of fear slipped through the corridors. Margaery Tyrell stood amidst it all, her grandmother at her side, and though her heart pounded, her gaze shone with the fierce determination of a queen who had learned that power must be guarded every moment it was held. So began the next chapter of their rule over King's Landing, where cunning and fortitude would be tested as never before, and where the rose and the lion still danced on uncertain ground. While, somewhere unseen, the seven-pointed star dripped with blood, a warning that no victory in Westeros ever truly came without cost.